Hey y'all, welcome to Paige's Perspective, where I help you find your inner strength to cope with life. This week has been a lot about generational patterns, cycles, curses, trauma, etc. Whatever you want to call it, that's what our Wednesday episode was about. And we had our weekly Independently Strong meeting discussing the patterns we're all trying to change. And I absolutely love these meetings. The growth, the discussions, they're just so damn empowering. And I love being part of the journey of others learning how to navigate life. I mean, that's really what we're trying to accomplish here. It's so much more than being a partner or spouse of an addict. It's learning life skills. Anyway, on to the topic. I didn't bring up something relevant in the recent episode that I felt needed to be brought up in my perspective episode. I wanted to dig deeper into why so many of us have the people-pleasing tendencies. This episode is going to be geared more towards women because women haven't had many rights and we've been fighting to have a voice for a long time. This does not negate the fact that some men have people-pleasing tendencies as well, but I'm not getting into that today. Just know that it isn't black and white, and just because I'm discussing women doesn't mean I don't understand the struggles men have. So, the question I'm asking is, are we living by old rules that no longer apply? People-pleasing, good girl syndrome, caretaking, these weren't technically things that we were born with. Our mothers and our grandmothers and our great-grandmothers, they had no choice necessarily but to put everyone else first. They weren't just being nice or selfless. They were surviving in a world where women had little to no rights. From the time they were little girls, they were trained to not rock the boat, keep quiet, avoid conflict, and never make others uncomfortable. They were taught to suppress their emotions. If something hurt them, they were told to let it go or be grateful for what they had, forgive and forget. Goodness, there's this song, the song Stand By Your Man by Tammy Wynette. It comes to mind whenever I was putting this episode together. And that song was released in 1968. So we'll get into the timeline of women's rights here in just a sec. But women were also taught to make everyone else comfortable, even at their own expense. Their value was measured by how much they could sacrifice because they didn't have many rights. They had to learn how to survive in a world where women were looked at as objects and they didn't have the option to leave. So here's a real question. Are we still playing by the same rules even though the game has changed? Society has changed, but how we were raised has a lot to do with how our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents had to survive. But we have the power to change it now. Times have changed. So we're going to break down why women were conditioned this way, how far we've come, and what patterns we may need to unlearn so that we can live on our own terms. Let's go through the timeline I was talking about just a moment ago. For most of history, women weren't raised to have a voice. They were raised to keep the peace, make men comfortable, and not ask for too much. In the 1800s and somewhat early 1900s, this is like a really long period of time, women were legally considered their husband's property. They couldn't own land. They couldn't have a bank account. They couldn't make decisions for themselves. And if you were stuck in an unhealthy marriage, you just had to deal with it. You had to learn how to not rock the boat or to speak up, because what could you do? Leaving wasn't an option. You had to learn to deal with it, which is, in these day and age, this is very unhealthy. And that shit has gotten passed down even to our generation. Let's go to the 1930s to the 1950s era. So this was like the perfect housewife era. Women were told their purpose was to serve their husband and raise kids, and divorce was looked at as bad, and abuse, that was just a private family matter. So what did women do? They learned to suppress their feelings and pretend everything was fine. And it even goes deeper than that. Women had to be perfect. Perfect house, perfect kids, perfect meals, and have no complaints. And this was also a time when women turned to substances to cope with their stress and anxiety. Y'all should search the ads from this time period because they were absolutely insane. And women felt trapped. And those women had to raise their kids with the same mindset they had to have to survive. And guys, this was the 1950s. Again, not that long ago. So the mentality was passed on to some of our mothers. Let's get to the 60s and 70s when feminism started to change things. Women could finally get on birth control. We could open credit cards without having a man's permission. And shockingly, leave a marriage without having to prove abuse or adultery. But let's be real. Many of us were still raised by moms who didn't have those freedoms. So the old mindset has stuck around. Let's get to the 80s and 90s. We had more legal rights, but the conditioning didn't disappear overnight. Women were still taught to be nice, likable, and accommodating because being direct or setting boundaries was considered bitchy or rude. It is deeply ingrained in many of us. Now, from the 2000s to today, we're talking more about boundaries. We're speaking up. We're talking about our self-worth. We're talking about generational trauma. We're having these discussions. We're talking about our feelings, our rights. We have a voice, but many of us are still unlearning the belief that our worth is tied to how much we can endure. Because for generations, women were taught that endurance equals strength. They were conditioned to believe that the ability to tolerate pain, mistreatment, emotional neglect was proof of their worth. And women were rewarded for endurance, not their happiness. For most of history, a woman's success was measured by how well she kept a marriage together, raised a family, and endured hardships without complaining. Divorce wasn't an option. Financial independence wasn't possible. And emotional fulfillment wasn't even on the table. So what did women do? They found meaning in their suffering. If you left, you were weak. If you stayed, you were strong. If you put up with mistreatment, you were loyal. If you set boundaries, you were selfish. Women had to reframe their pain as a badge of honor because they weren't given a way out. Many women were raised with messages like marriage is forever, no matter what. Love means sticking together through thick and thin. A strong woman holds her family together. Forgive, forget, and move on. And this messaging rarely emphasized mutual respect. Instead, it reinforced the idea that the burden of keeping a relationship alive falls on a woman. Fear of being seen as the bad guy. If a woman left, she risked being labeled as a quitter, a bad wife, selfish for putting herself first, difficult for expecting better. Society often praises women for enduring suffering, but criticizes them for choosing themselves. Women are often told, you're so strong for putting up with all of this, but real strength isn't about enduring pain. It's about refusing to accept it as your normal. Strength isn't staying in a bad situation. Resilience isn't about how much you can tolerate. It's about refusing to tolerate what breaks you. Loyalty isn't measured by suffering. It's measured by mutual respect. So why do women still believe this? Because for generations, women had no other option but to endure. Because leaving wasn't possible, because suffering was romanticized, because they were raised by mothers who never had the chance to choose themselves. Strength looks different now. We are one of the first generations of women who have the ability to leave bad relationships. We have the options to have financial independence. We can set boundaries and be heard. We don't have to glorify suffering as proof of love. And one of the hardest mindset shifts for women today is realizing that leaving doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're finally strong enough to choose yourself or your children. Our grandmothers and mothers couldn't prioritize themselves, but we can. And the problem is a lot of us still don't because we were raised to think we shouldn't. So let's talk about some of the specific habits we need to unlearn. Stop saying yes when we want to say no. Our moms and grandmothers weren't allowed to have boundaries. No wonder we struggled to set them. They were taught to say yes to everything. Stop avoiding conflict at all costs. Many of us were raised to keep the peace even when we were being disrespected. We fear conflict because we were taught to be good. Stop feeling guilty for taking up space. If you've ever felt bad for setting boundaries or saying what you need, this is why. Stop suppressing needs and feelings. Women were taught to put their emotions aside to take care of everyone else. I know that some men have felt this way too, but that's not what I'm talking about here. Maybe Matt can do a newsletter or something on his thoughts with the conditioning men have had to endure over the years. But anyway, it's time to unlearn this shit. Like some may say that women are emotional and are able to express themselves. However, we're only allowed to express our happiness, maybe a little bit of sadness, but anger? Hell no. God forbid we be angry because we're supposed to hold it all together. Fuck that. Anger is necessary. And I'm not talking about aggression. I did an episode on that, but anger. It's a survival emotion that needs to be addressed. We fear asking for something we need because we've been conditioned to keep that to ourselves and take care of everything, which honestly, I still don't ask for much help, but that is because I learned from doing things on my own. It's not because I don't want to put someone out. I have to do things for myself first for learning purposes. And that may be another episode to dig into, but we have needs and it's okay to ask that they be met, especially by our most intimate partners. So we have more freedom than any other generation before us. We are allowed to leave situations that are unhealthy. We do not have to keep the peace at our own expense. We don't owe anyone our silence, endurance, or suffering. And listen, this is not about blaming past generations. Our mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers, they did what they had to do in a world that gave them no choices. But we have choices and we have to start using them. So how do we break free from all of this? Here's what we need to start practicing. Say no without over-explaining. I believe we discussed this in our most recent episode. No is a complete sentence. You don't have to justify it. Stop apologizing for existing. We've been conditioned to soften everything that we say. We don't have to do that anymore. Stop believing that love requires suffering. Love is about mutual effort. Redefine what it means to be a good woman. A good woman, and I'm doing that in air quotes, I'm going to say a healthy woman, isn't someone who sacrifices herself for everyone else. It's someone who is true to herself, someone who lives by her values, someone who chooses growth and recognizes the patterns that need to be broken, not just for us, but for our children and their children. We need to redefine this shit. Listen, guys, I am a happily married woman to a man I've been with since I was 14 years old, and I still believe it's okay to leave an unhealthy situation because we do have rights. We do have options. There are some programs out there that still condition people to think like a 1950s housewife because they haven't updated with the times. Things are different now. I will not encourage anyone to stay in an abusive situation because I know what it can do to our mental health, to our kids' well-being, and their kids' well-being. We have the ability to stop those patterns and change what we were conditioned to do. I used to have the traditional gender roles mentality because I was a stay-at-home mom. However, I always knew that I could leave if I absolutely had to. I knew I had rights and didn't have to stick in a shitty situation because of love. We need to question how we have been raised and recognize what doesn't apply any longer. Break those cycles, break those patterns. It's not necessary to endure pain or accept the unacceptable anymore. And here's the deal. Just because our mothers and grandmothers had to suppress their needs doesn't mean that we have to. Breaking these habits isn't disrespecting the women who came before us. It's honoring them by evolving in ways they never got to. Sure, they have the tools now to change if they wanted to, if they're still around. They can seek therapy and help to change the conditioning, but even if they don't, you sure as hell can. The best way to honor the sacrifices of past generations is to live fully in the freedom they never had. So anytime you are afraid to rock the boat, even with your parents, just know you're actually honoring them by changing the patterns of the family dynamics. Shifting the perspective may change your life, even if they don't agree with what you're changing. We don't need to justify or explain why to them because they may not understand. It's okay. Do you and trust your gut on changing the generational patterns that hold you back, that hold your children back. That's all I have for this week. Until next time, I'm Paige. Bye.